December 24th, 1944. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The snow fell in thick, silent curtains across the barracks compound, each flake catching the amber glow of electric lights strung carelessly between wooden buildings. Inside Barrack 7, 43 Japanese prisoners of war sat cross-legged on clean pine floors, their backs rigid, their faces carefully composed into masks of indifference. The air smelled of pine resin and something unfamiliar, something sweet and buttery, that drifted through the ventilation grates from the kitchens beyond. Outside, American guards stamped their boots against the cold, their breath forming small clouds in the Wisconsin winter. Inside, the prisoners waited as they had learned to wait since their capture, suspended between the world they had known and this strange, incomprehensible reality that defied everything their training had promised them about death, about honor, about the enemy, who now fed them 3 meals a day. In the corner of the barracks, Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto stared at his hands. They were clean. Impossibly, humiliatingly clean. The nails had been trimmed by a medical officer 2 weeks prior. The calluses from his rifle were softening. He could still remember the weight of his Arisaka Type 38, the way it had felt like an extension of his own arm during the brutal fighting on Saipan. He remembered, too, the moment of his capture in July, 5 months ago now, when the Marines had found him semi-conscious in a collapsed bunker, his leg shattered, his unit commander's final order still echoing in his ears: death before dishonor. No surrender. The Emperor watches always. He had failed that order. He had lived. And now, in this place of heated barracks and abundant food, he was learning that survival itself could become a form of torture more profound than any battlefield death. The path that led these men to a prisoner of war camp in rural Wisconsin began not in the snow-covered American Midwest, but in the tropical heat of the Pacific Theater, where the ideology of Bushido collided with modern industrial warfare. From the moment Japan entered the Second World War with the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japanese military indoctrination had prepared its soldiers for victory or death, but never for the gray space between. The Imperial Japanese Army's field manual, the Senjinkan, issued in 1941, was explicit in its instruction: do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to avoid the ignominy of capture. This was not mere rhetoric. This was doctrine drilled into every recruit from his first day of training, reinforced through stories of ancestral warriors, through the cult of the emperor as living deity, through a carefully constructed worldview in which surrender represented not simply military defeat but spiritual annihilation. This ideology created a military force of extraordinary tenacity and courage, one that would fight to near extinction on islands like Tarawa, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. But it also created a profound psychological crisis for those who, through wounds, unconsciousness, or the simple chaos of battle, found themselves in enemy hands. Records from the early Pacific campaigns show surrender rates among Japanese forces hovering near 0.5%, orders of magnitude lower than any other combatant nation in the war. On Attu Island in May 1943, only 20 Japanese soldiers were captured out of a garrison of 2,500. The rest died in combat or in the final Banzai charge. On Tarawa in November 1943, of the 2,800 Japanese defenders, only 17 were captured alive, most of them unconscious or too severely wounded to commit suicide. These men had not surrendered, they had failed to die. Takeshi Yamamoto had been one of the failures. He had been a good soldier, a loyal soldier. Born in 1922 in a village outside Hiroshima, he had entered military service at 18 with pride, had trained with dedication, had learned to march 30 miles in full pack, had learned to survive on 2 bowls of rice a day, had learned to venerate the emperor as a living god whose divine will flowed through the chain of command to every private in every unit. He had learned, too, the stories of the Americans, the soft, decadent, materialistic Americans who knew nothing of sacrifice or discipline, who came from a mongrel nation without honor or spiritual depth, whose soldiers were merchants in uniform, playing at war until things became difficult. The propaganda had been consistent, pervasive, convincing. Americans, he had been taught, were individually cowardly, but collectively dangerous because of their industrial capacity. They had machines, yes, but they lacked warrior spirit. They would torture prisoners as a matter of course because they did not understand Bushido, did not understand the codes that elevated warfare above mere violence. Surrender to Americans meant torture, humiliation, and death after unbearable suffering. So when Takeshi had awakened in an American field hospital on Saipan, his first emotion had not been relief, but terror. The morphine in his system dulled the worst of the pain from his shattered femur, but could not dull the certainty of what would come next. He had watched the American medic, a boy who looked no older than himself, check the wound dressing, adjust the plasma line, make a note on a clipboard. The medic had not struck him, had not cursed him, had not seemed to notice or care that the man he was treating had, days before, been trying to kill Americans. This indifference was somehow more unsettling than cruelty would have been. Cruelty he understood. Cruelty fit the narrative he had been given. This casual, almost bored professionalism did not fit at all. The journey from field hospital to the Hawaiian internment facility, and then to the mainland United States, had been a continuous assault on everything Takashi thought he knew about the enemy and about himself. The food kept coming. 3 times a day, regular as clockwork. Not scraps, not punishment rations, but actual meals. Bread, meat, vegetables, fruit. In the Hawaiian facility, he and other Japanese prisoners had initially refused to eat, certain the food was poisoned or drugged. But hunger eventually won, as it always does, and the meals continued to arrive, unpoisoned, substantial, strangely familiar in their portions and regularity. On the transport ship to the mainland, the prisoners had been kept in holds that were cramped but clean, with adequate water and regular exercise periods on deck. Some of the prisoners had expected to be thrown overboard mid-voyage. When they arrived in San Francisco and were transferred to trains heading east, still alive, still fed, the cognitive dissonance had begun to crack through even the most rigid ideological certainty. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, had become operational as a POW facility in 1943, initially housing German and Italian prisoners before the Japanese arrivals began in late 1943 and 1944. The camp was built to specifications outlined by the Geneva Convention, which the United States, as a signatory, was obligated to follow. Japan had not signed the 1929 Geneva Convention, but had indicated it would follow its provisions mutatis mutandis, with necessary changes. In practice, Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners ranged from harsh to atrocious, with death rates in Japanese captivity reaching 27% compared to 1% in German POW camps. But this fact, while known to American intelligence, did not alter the United States' commitment to its own standards. The rules and procedures was incomprehensible through the lens they had been given. In the early months at Camp McCoy, many of the prisoners had maintained their rigid discipline, their ceremonies honoring the emperor, their conviction that this apparent kindness was simply a more sophisticated form of psychological torture. They mocked the American guards who treated them with casual informality rather than the harsh severity they expected from captors. They laughed, quietly, privately, among themselves, at the absurdity of Americans who seemed to care whether prisoners were warm enough, fed enough, healthy enough. It was weakness, they assured each other. American decadence. The soft belly of a nation that valued comfort over honor, material abundance over spiritual strength. Sergeant Hiroshi Nakamura, the senior NCO among the prisoners in Barracks 7, had been particularly vocal in his contempt. A career soldier from a samurai family, Nakamura had survived the brutal fighting on Guam before his capture in August 1944. In the hierarchy of the imprisoned, his rank and experience gave him authority, and he used that authority to maintain discipline, to preserve what dignity remained to men who had lost everything by surviving. "They feed us like livestock being fattened," he had said one evening in October, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "They want us soft, compliant, broken in spirit, so we will betray our emperor when they finally begin the interrogations." The fact that the interrogations had been brief, focused only on tactical military information, and had involved no torture seemed to Nakamura only evidence of American patience, not American principle. But ideology, no matter how deeply embedded, cannot stand forever against the steady erosion of contradictory experience. Through the fall of 1944, small fissures had begun to appear in the prisoners' collective certainty. There was the camp doctor, Major Franklin Weber, who treated a severe infection in Private Kenji Sato's foot with the same careful attention he would have given an American soldier, who changed the dressings himself rather than delegating to an orderly, who checked on Sato's progress daily until the infection cleared. There was the supply sergeant who issued winter coats when the Wisconsin cold arrived, coats that were thick and well-made, identical to those worn by American troops. There was the education officer who offered English language classes and provided books, actual books from the camp library, to prisoners who showed interest in reading. Most significantly, there was the food, the abundance of food. By November, the prisoners in Barracks 7 were receiving approximately 2,800 calories per day, the same ration scale as American troops in garrison. Breakfast was hot cereal or eggs, bread with butter, coffee. Lunch was soup, sandwiches, fruit. Dinner was meat, potatoes or rice, vegetables, sometimes dessert. For men who had often campaigned on 1,000 calories a day in the Pacific, whose standard field ration had been rice and pickled vegetables with occasional dried fish, this abundance was staggering. Private Yamamoto had gained 15 pounds since his capture. His uniform, when he was issued a standard POW outfit, had to be let out at the waist. He was ashamed of this weight gain, this visible evidence of survival and adaptation. But he was also, in moments he barely admitted to himself, grateful for the absence of hunger, for the simple certainty that tomorrow would bring another meal. The symbolism of food, of abundance, of careless plenty, had begun to work on the prisoners in ways that barbed wire and guards never could. In the Japanese military culture they had known, scarcity was a virtue. Endurance of hunger was a mark of warrior spirit. To need less, to survive on less, to continue fighting while American soldiers required their mountains of supplies and their elaborate logistics, this was proof of superiority, of spiritual strength that trumped material weakness. But at Camp McCoy, the abundance was not presented as luxury or excess. It was simply normal. The American guards ate the same food from the same kitchens. The camp commander made no speeches about generosity or magnanimity. The meals arrived with the same bureaucratic regularity as mail call or roll count. This ordinariness was perhaps the most subversive element of all. December arrived with early snow and the peculiar hushed quality that comes to northern landscapes in deep winter. The prisoners had been informed that December 25th was Christmas, a significant American holiday, and that special arrangements were being made. Sergeant Nakamura had scoffed at this announcement. Another trick, he had said. They want to see us celebrate their Christian festival, to report to their newspapers that they have converted the heathen Japanese. But the younger prisoners were curious despite themselves. They had heard of Christmas from the few who had traveled before the war, from the fragments of Western culture that had penetrated pre-war Japan. A winter festival, gifts, elaborate meals, a celebration of family and peace that seemed impossibly distant from the war they had known. On the morning of December 24th, the work details were canceled. The prisoners were told to remain in their barracks. Through the windows, they could see unusual activity in the camp. Trucks arrived carrying supplies. Groups of American soldiers were stringing lights, setting up what appeared to be decorated trees near the mess hall. The camp chaplain, Captain Matthew Sorensen, visited each barracks personally to explain that tomorrow, Christmas Day, there would be special services for those interested and a festive meal in the evening. He was careful, respectful, explaining that participation was entirely voluntary, that no one would be forced to observe a holiday outside their own tradition. His Japanese was halting but sincere, supplemented by gestures and the help of a Nisei translator who had joined the camp staff. That evening, December 24th, as the winter darkness came early and complete, the prisoners of Barracks 7 sat in their customary silence. But it was a different silence now, charged with expectation and uncertainty. Private Yamamoto found his thoughts drifting away from the war, away from the question of honor and shame that had consumed him for 5 months. He was thinking instead of his village, of the winter festivals of his childhood, of his mother's careful preparation of special foods for New Year's celebrations, of the way his father would lead the family in prayers at the household shrine. Those memories seemed to belong to another life, to another Takashi who had existed before the war taught him that such gentle moments were weaknesses to be burned away in the forge of military discipline. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, someone coughed. Someone else shifted position, and the floorboards creaked. And then, faintly at first, they heard it. Music. American music, carried on the cold air from somewhere near the camp center. A choir of voices singing in harmony, the melody unfamiliar, but strangely affecting in its gentleness. The prisoners listened in spite of themselves. Sergeant Nakamura's face was unreadable in the dim light. Private Yamamoto felt something tighten in his chest, some emotion he could not name, did not want to name. Christmas morning, December 25th, 1944, arrived clear and bright, the snow reflecting brilliant sunshine that made the prisoners squint when they emerged for morning roll call. The camp had been transformed. The decorated trees they had glimpsed being erected the day before were now fully revealed, evergreen pines strung with lights and ornaments, surrounded by wrapped packages. The guards were in unusually good spirits, laughing and trading greetings, their breath fogging in the cold air. After roll call, instead of returning to barracks, the prisoners were directed to the recreation hall, a large wooden building used for meetings and, occasionally, film screenings. Inside the recreation hall, the prisoners stopped, uncertain. Long tables had been set up, covered with white cloths. The tables were laden with food, but not the utilitarian meals they were accustomed to. These were platters of roasted turkey and ham, bowls of mashed potatoes and gravy, vegetables prepared in styles the prisoners did not recognize, baskets of fresh bread rolls, plates of butter, dishes of cranberry sauce, pies, apple and pumpkin, arranged with careful presentation. At the front of the hall stood a tall Christmas tree, decorated with colored glass ornaments that caught the light. And beneath the tree, arranged in neat rows, were packages, each tagged with a prisoner number. The camp commander, Colonel James Whitmore, stood at the front of the hall and waited for the prisoners to file in and find seats. He was a veteran of the First World War, a man in his 50s with gray hair and a manner that combined military precision with an unexpected gentleness. When he spoke, the Nisei translator rendered his words into Japanese, sentence by careful sentence. "Gentlemen," Colonel Whitmore began, "today is Christmas, a holiday of peace and goodwill. I know this is not your holiday. I know that many of you are far from home, far from everything familiar. I know that you did not choose to be here, in this camp, in this country. But you are here, and we are here, and for today we have chosen to set aside the war and remember that before we were soldiers, we were men. Before we were enemies, we were human beings. The food you see before you is the same meal being served today to American soldiers around the world, to American families in their homes. We share it with you not as an act of superiority or charity, but as an acknowledgement of our common humanity. Today, at least, let us have peace." The prisoners sat in stunned silence. Some, like Sergeant Nakamura, maintained their rigid posture, their faces carefully blank. Others, like Private Yamamoto, found themselves staring at the abundance before them with something approaching incomprehension. The American soldiers serving the meal began to circulate, placing portions on plates, offering seconds, moving with the same casual efficiency they would employ at any mess hall service. No ceremony, no speeches, just food, offered freely, abundant beyond any reasonable need. Private Yamamoto accepted a plate, heavy with turkey and potatoes and vegetables he could not name. The smells were overwhelming, rich, savory, complex. He took a bite of turkey. The meat was tender, seasoned with herbs, nothing like the dried fish or pickled vegetables that had sustained him through campaigns in the Pacific. He took another bite, and another. Around him, other prisoners were eating, slowly at first, then with increasing abandon as hunger and the sheer novelty of the food overcame trained restraint. The hall filled with the sounds of eating, of forks on plates, of murmured comments in Japanese as prisoners tried to identify flavors and textures completely outside their experience. And then came the gifts. Colonel Whitmore explained that the Red Cross and various American civilian organizations had prepared packages for all prisoners of war in American camps. Each prisoner was called forward by number to receive a package from beneath the tree. Private Yamamoto's number was called. He approached the tree, accepted a wrapped box from an American lieutenant who handed it to him with a simple Merry Christmas in English. Yamamoto returned to his seat and, after a moment's hesitation, unwrapped the package. Inside, a warm scarf, knitted wool in dark blue. A pair of warm socks. A bar of soap, the good kind that smelled of pine. A small notebook and 2 pencils. A photograph of an American landscape, mountains and forest. And at the bottom, wrapped in wax paper, a chocolate bar. The chocolate. Yamamoto lifted it from the box and stared at it. He had tasted chocolate once, before the war, a small piece in shop in Hiroshima. It had seemed the height of impossible luxury then, a taste of the modern world that Japan was rushing to join. Now, holding this chocolate bar in a prison camp in Wisconsin, it seemed to represent something else entirely. Abundance so casual it could be given away. Sweetness without purpose or profit. A gift from strangers who owed him nothing, who had every reason to hate him, whose countrymen he had tried to kill. He unwrapped the chocolate carefully, broke off a small piece, placed it in his mouth. The sweetness exploded across his tongue, rich and complex, melting into cream and sugar and something indefinably comforting. And without warning, without intention, Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto began to cry. Silently at first, just tears running down his face as he sat very still, the chocolate melting in his mouth. Then his shoulders began to shake. Then a sound escaped him, a small broken sound that he tried to stifle but could not. He was not alone. Across the recreation hall, other prisoners were weeping. Young men and old soldiers, privates and sergeants, all of them overcome by the simple, devastating kindness of this Christmas meal, these gifts, this treatment that contradicted everything they had been taught about the enemy and about themselves. The psychological armor they had constructed to survive capture, to maintain dignity in defeat, to preserve loyalty to an emperor and an ideology that had sent them to die. That armor was cracking, fissuring, falling away in pieces under the assault of roasted turkey and chocolate and warm socks, and the extraordinary revolutionary idea that perhaps their captors saw them not as subhuman demons, but as men. Sergeant Nakamura sat rigid at his table, his face a mask, his untouched plate before him. But his hands, resting on the table, were trembling. The food, the gifts, the music now playing from a phonograph in the corner, Christmas carols in English that none of the prisoners understood, but whose gentle melodies seemed to speak of something universal. All of it was battering against his certainty, his conviction that this was psychological warfare, that Americans were soft and decadent and therefore contemptible. Because what kind of nation gives chocolate to prisoners of war? What kind of army feeds its enemies turkey and pie on its holiest holiday? What kind of soldiers hand out hand-knitted scarves to men who tried to kill them? The answer, Nakamura was beginning to understand with a terror more profound than any he had felt in combat, was a nation and an army confident enough in its own values not to need cruelty. An enemy that did not hate, and whose mercy was therefore not weakness, but strength.